John, there are two allegations in the new Woodward-Costa book that have to do with this building, in particular, whether General Milley inserted himself into the nuclear launch process. Is there anything unusual that you've seen, or that is the Defense Secretary concerned about the reports that General Milley inserted himself tried to stop the president at the time from having the ability to launch nuclear weapons? Can you explain how the process works? And it's been explained to us that he went through, reviewed the procedures, and that he told them that he should be on any conference call with the president, that's part of the procedures. Is that part of the nuclear procedures? I'm confused.
Well, I certainly can't speak to the revelations that are coming out in the book. I think you saw a statement by the chairman's office specifically addressing this issue. What I can tell you is that it is not uncommon at all for the department to continue to review security protocols, particularly when it comes to our strategic deterrence capabilities, that we constantly take a look at the protocols and the procedures to make sure that they are still relevant. And these protocols have been in place for a long time, a couple of decades, and so it's not uncommon. It's also completely appropriate, and again, I'm not speaking to the validity of things that are in the book, but it is completely appropriate for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as the senior military advisor to both the secretary and the president, to want to see those protocols reviewed on whatever frequent basis that he wants to do that. So again, I can't speak to the validity, but I see nothing in what I've read that would cause any concern.
What is the chairman's role in terms of the nuclear launch, if there were a nuclear launch by the president?
Well, the chairman is the key military advisor to the president, to the commander-in-chief. And in a sequence of events whereby a commander-in-chief would be making that decision, that most grave of decisions, the chairman would be intimately involved in that process, in providing advice and counsel to both the secretary and to the president. Obviously, the president in this case makes the final decision. And by statute, by law, he is the prime military advisor to the president, and this would be a military decision of profound proportions here and importance. So he would be absolutely involved in that process, soup to nuts.
And was there anything unusual said to the Chinese counterpart in the phone calls, as far as you understand?
Well, again, all I've seen is the same reporting that you've seen, Jen. I can't speak to the specifics of the conversation, a conversation that took place obviously before this administration took office. But I would add, if I may, again, that it is not only common, it's expected that a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would continue to have counterpart conversations. I mean, he is basically the chief of defense for the United States. We don't call him that, but he has chief of defense counterparts around the world. And having worked for a chairman myself for quite a bit, I can tell you frequent communication with two countries like Russia and China is not atypical at all for a chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And those communications are they're routine, they're staffed, they're coordinated, and they're transparent, as transparent as they can be.
Would it also be routine in these counterpart conversations if the United States was planning to strike one of these locations for the chairman to inform?
I was trying to hear what that question was.
The U.S. was about to strike, as is quoted in the
Yeah, again, I'm not going to get into the confirming or speaking to details in reported.
Would that be a common part of these conversations, is if the United States was planning to conduct a strike on a location,
right,
would the chairman then call his counterpart to alert them to an incoming strike?
Without speaking to that hypothetical, what I again would say is that these parts of the value, a part of the value of having these communications, particularly with countries like Russia and China, with which we are experiencing tension, is to try to reduce the risks of miscalculation and conflict, to try to take down tensions, to make clear what our national security interests are on you pick the issue. And that's the communication channel between our chairman and a chief of defense is a really key vehicle for transmitting and communicating those kinds of messages.
And then has Secretary Austin, based off of the stories out of this book, has he instructed General Milley to change any of the ways that he's operating? Has he asked him to inform him more about some of the conversations that he's having? Has there been any practical change on this current Pentagon
Absolutely
leadership?
not. No, not in the least. Has full trust and confidence in Chairman Milley and the job that he's doing. Laura?
Thanks, John.
So they're listening to some comments, questioned about Mark Milley and whether or not it was inappropriate for him to have had conversations with China.
He was clearly ready for the question.
Yes, yeah. He said it's both common and expected for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to have conversations with his counterpart in this regard.
And that he was a key military advisor to the president, so any decision, for instance, to launch a nuclear weapon, as an example, he would be involved with that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
So clearly trying to downplay what to a lot of people were explosive allegations, because they're leaving out some of the conversations that are represented about that he had, for instance, with Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, as well as about his commander-in-chief, President Trump.
And I think that's what that last question was getting to, which is why we went back to it for you, because people questioning whether or not this was an effort to reduce the risk or whether or not it was perhaps a warning. There's a significant difference in how this would be handled based on how you answer that.